let's move on to the topic for this second session. I want to start with the second of the 5 determinants of happiness in the Bamba model, and this is called autonomy. Autonomy is the same thing as freedom. Okay, let me start this topic by first mentioning that all of us have a high desire for controlling other people, controlling outcomes. If we are totally honest with ourselves, we would admit that we love for other people to behave exactly like we want them to behave. We want our spouses to behave a certain way, we want our children to behave a certain way, we want our neighbors to behave a certain way, we want our co-workers to behave a certain way, our colleagues, and even our pets. Okay? And the reason why we want to control them is because we have a story in our head. And the story is, if only the world were to behave like I want them to behave, not only would I be happy, they would be happy too. Why, oh, why can't people see how wise, well-meaning, and smart I am? And why don't people just obey me? It'll make everybody happy. Okay? So in my house, my wife sometimes tries to control how much I eat. She thinks I'm a little bit like that pig. I eat too much, even though I don't show it on my body because I have a high metabolism. And sometimes I'm a little bit upset with my wife for shopping too much. Unless, of course, she shops for me, then I'm happy. And if for some reason, one day we are not controlling each other, we try to control our kids. And our kids are exceptionally badly behaved, particularly in public spaces. Now they're becoming a little bit better, but sometimes we go to a restaurant and my son is, running around and my daughter is poking her nose with her finger and so on, and so we try to control them. Okay, so this desire for control is prevalent. It's all over the place. Everybody tries to control either other people or outcomes, events. For example, that I want a certain kind of a event to happen. I want to achieve this goal, or I want the weather to be a certain way, and so on and so forth. Now, there's a lot of research that's been done on control, and it turns out that it actually affects our happiness a lot. I want to share with you 2 studies very quickly. One study was done with rats, and in this study they had 3 groups of rats. One group of rats was the control group. Nothing happened to this group of rats. They were in their cage, and it was just normal life. The second and the third group of rats were given cocaine, okay, this drug. They were given cocaine, and the way that they were given cocaine is that they were hooked up to a machine which had this intravenous apparatus that injected cocaine into their bloodstream, and all they had to do to get ingested with cocaine was go to the corner of the cage and press a lever. And if they pressed the lever, they got ingested with cocaine. Okay? So this was group number 2 that could decide to have cocaine right now. All it would have to do is go to the corner of the cage and press the lever. It would get high. The third group of rats also got cocaine, but they had no control over when and how much cocaine they did. This group of rats, each individual rat in this group was tethered to another individual in group 2. So whenever a rat in group 2 decided to have cocaine, this other rat in group 3, to which it was tethered, would also get automatically high. So it had no control over how much cocaine, when to do it, etc. The experimenters were interested in finding out how long these rats lived. And it turned out that 2 major themes emerged from the study. The first theme is that if you want to live really long, you shouldn't do drugs. Okay? And the second theme that emerged is that if you do choose to do drugs, it's better to have control over how much and when you do it. The second group of rats, which had control over how much cocaine and when they got to do cocaine, lived far longer than the third group of rats. Okay, the study shows that even for animals, being in control, even for bad things, is very, very important. The second study I want to tell you a little bit about is actually with human beings, and this was conducted back in the 1970s and has been replicated 4 times across various other countries. It was conducted in the United States by Ellen Langer, who's a researcher at Harvard, and her colleagues. And what they did is they went to an old age home. This was in 1973, right? A long time back. Went to an old age home, and they divided the people in that old age home into 2 groups. One group of residents got to have control over seemingly trivial things, like what kind of a plant to grow in their room and what kind of a movie that they want to see over the weekend. So this group was ask these questions. Do you want this plant or do you want this plant to grow in your room? And here are a list of movies. Which movie would you like to see this weekend? Okay, and if a majority chose a particular movie, they showed that movie over the weekend. That was the first group. The second group had no control over these really trivial decisions: what plant to grow, what movie to watch. Okay, and the researchers came back a year and a half later, 18 months later, and looked at how happy the individuals in each of these two groups were and what the mortality rate of these individuals in these two groups were. Now, remember that this is an old age home. These people are living out the last days of their life, so the mortality rate was pretty high. Okay? In the group that had no control, which is the normal life, usually they don't have control over these decisions. Usually somebody else picks plants for their rooms and movies that they're going to see over the weekend. In the group that had no control, 30% had died in that 1.5 years. Okay, 30%, which is a high number, but you have to remember this is an old age home. In the group that had control over these seemingly trivial decisions, right, really trivial decisions, which movies to watch, which plants to grow, the mortality rate was half, 15%. Huge effect. Okay? Not just the mortality rate, even the happiness levels were very, very different. Among the people who had no control, the happiness levels were about 4.7 out of 7-point scale. Not bad. But in the group that had control, it was 5.3. Okay? So it turns out that control is super important for us in our lives, and we can't really be totally happy if we don't have that sense of autonomy. And if we don't have autonomy, we try and gain autonomy. I've heard that when Bulgaria was ruled under the communist regime, where autonomy is a little bit lower than in democracies, people rebelled by listening to heavy metal music. Okay, we're going to listen to this thing that we are not supposed to listen to that's coming to us from the West. That's our way of showing that, yeah, I want to retain my autonomy. Okay, so it turns out autonomy is super important at work too. In fact, it may be the biggest determinant of your happiness, above the average level of salary for your industry. If you're getting the average level of salary for your industry, what is a much more bigger determinant of your happiness and unhappiness is the level of autonomy that you have. If you have a high level of autonomy, you have a lot of freedom to do as you want in the company, and people respect your decisions and take action on it, then you're going to be much happier than if you're not given that autonomy. Okay, autonomy versus money, that article talks about autonomy being more important. The key to happiness at work isn't money, it's autonomy, etc., etc. Lots of studies on this. 3 things that you can do for your coworkers or your organization can do for you in order to increase your sense of autonomy. And you will see that not all of these things have to do directly with work. Because one of the biggest killers of autonomy is not to be your true authentic self at work. There is a guy called Frederick Laloux who does a lot of work on this. He's got a very good book called Reinventing Organizations. And his claim is that we only bring 1/16 of our personality to work. We only bring 1/16 of our personality to work, which is a very, very low number, of course. And so we can't be our full selves. We can't really voice our true opinions about which political party we like, for example, or what kind of attitude we have towards various kinds of music and so on and so forth at work. And that really brings down our happiness level. So the first recommendation I have here is to encourage people to bring their whole self to work. And in particular, there are 2 recommendations I have here in terms of how you can operationalize this. One is to what's called shine your light, or allow the employees to shine their light. Everybody has some talents, some interests. So shine your light events are where people are encouraged, say a particular day in the week, maybe Friday evening, to perform a talent that they have, or tell us about a hobby that they have, or tell us about an interest that they have. Maybe they travel to Vietnam and they get to show photographs from their trip and what they learned on that trip and what they like about the culture on that trip, and so on and so forth with their other colleagues, so that we get to know our colleagues at a more full level rather than just their work personality. I do that in my own class on happiness, and I think it's a big contributor to me winning some teaching awards, because when students get a chance to express their hobbies, their interests, and show off their talents, they really feel that other people are getting to see their full self rather than only a partial self. The second recommendation I have is to encourage your employees to personalize their space. This is a very, very small thing that organizations can allow their employees to do, and it turns out to have a very, very big effect on the happiness of the employees. And maybe in the firm that you work for, it already happens. But there was a study done which looked at Southwest Airlines as a case study, where in that company, it's very, very famous for this, that they allow people to personalize their space. So people put up photographs of their family, they put up quotes that really inspire them and so on. And that personalization makes them feel much more at home, makes them feel a sense of freedom when they come into work. Another company that does it is a company called IDEO. And the employees of this company decided one fine day that they needed a wing of an airplane, right? A DC-3 airplane in their office. And so they then kind of lobbied to get a budget to buy that wing of a DC-3 airplane, and they hung it up in their office. And everybody's happiness went up a little bit because they felt like, yeah, you know, our bosses listen to us when we want something that's a little bit quirky, a little bit maybe stupid, a little bit silly, but it makes me feel that this is a place in which I can voice my true opinions and people actually listen and there's an impact. Okay, so let me move on to the second thing that you can do, is to help employees understand what they need to do in order to gain autonomy, right? This is very much to the point that you were mentioning. So sometimes an employee does not have the authority to have autonomy because they behave perhaps in an irresponsible fashion, in a fashion that they are not accountable. So this is a gentleman here. His name is Sunny Singh. He is the CEO of a company called Edifex. And this company does back-end medical data work for many companies. So they keep track of the employees' health and so on. This is a company in Seattle. And what he does for his employees is he provides feedback to his employees on how well they're doing at their job and how much he and the other bosses, other senior leaders in the company respect that employee's opinions and think that that employee is behaving in a responsible, accountable fashion, all with the aim of making that employee understand what they need to do in order to have the autonomy. Okay, and so one thing that they do is that they don't wait for the end of the year to do these appraisals and evaluations of the employees. These appraisals happen on a regular basis and in a very, very informal setting. So they have this habit of going to a nearby coffee shop. You might know that Seattle is the home of a Starbucks, right? So they go to this nearby Starbucks and they just have a very friendly discussion after work on what the senior managers feel about the employees' levels of accountability and responsibility so that the employees understand what they need to do in order to gain the autonomy. So the idea here is to not wait until the end of the year to make it more formal and pass on evaluations, because nobody likes these year-end appraisals. Neither the employee, of course, but neither does the manager typically. So it's much better to make it much more informal and regular, and also to focus on what you as a boss feel your employees need to do in order to gain autonomy. The very last one, this is actually a very interesting one, is to reduce what's called busy work, right? I think poster child as an example for busy work is happens in jails often around the world, where prisoners are asked to dig a hole and then fill up the hole and then dig a hole again and then fill up the hole again and then dig a hole again and so on. This is the epitome of pointless work, busy work, that accomplishes no real objective, but you're kept busy all the time. And people hate busy work. They don't like to do things that have no ulterior meaning or ulterior aim. So here are a few suggestions that have been studied in the research that reduces busy work or perception of busy work and therefore increases happiness. One is to reduce face time. What do I mean by face time? I mean this idea that I have to show up at work even if I don't have work so that I can show other people that I came to work. Okay? It turns out that when you don't have work and you're not given the freedom to not show up for work, and you have to show up for work, and you're rated and evaluated by other people, particularly your senior management or leadership, on how much time you show face time, how much time you're merely present at work, even if you're not actually doing anything. So people don't like it. people don't like FaceTime. So that is one thing, to reduce FaceTime. And in particular, one way in which you can reduce this FaceTime thing is by discouraging contacting your employees during weekends or after the work hour is finished for the day. So for example, 5 p.m. Do you know that there are 2 countries in Europe that have actually instituted this as a governmental policy, that organizations and employers cannot contact their employees during the weekends and after the workday is over? Do you guys know which countries these are? Yes? France and Germany. That's right, exactly, okay? And this is only in the last 2 or 3 years that this has happened. Now, a lot of managers, a lot of senior leaders are very worried that if you give people this law that you cannot contact your employees after 5 p.m., let's say, or 6 p.m., and during the weekends, big worry is that the productivity is going to come down, right? But you know what the studies are showing? The productivity actually goes up. Okay, this is very consistent with what I showed you at the beginning, which is that happier people are more productive. You're much more productive, much more efficient in the little time that you're actually at work. And if you know that you're not going to be contacted by your boss and other employees after a certain time, you know that you have to finish the work by that time. So you're much more efficient, you're much less likely to fritter away your time on internet or in idly chatting with other people. Another kind of controversial idea, perhaps, but nevertheless been researched and found to really work, is forcing your employees to take vacations. Okay, and I don't know how popular this might be in Bulgaria as an idea, but I can tell you in the United States what happens is that there's a lot of firms that give you even the option of taking as much vacation as you want to take. Really, like Google, for example. You can take as much vacation as you want to take. It turns out that people don't actually use that. Why? Because they're afraid that if I do take up this opportunity to take a lot of vacation, I'm going to be out of the loop. When I come back, maybe I won't understand what's going on. Maybe in the power play to rise up in the organization, I'll be left out. So there's a fear that prevents people from taking these vacations. And on average in the United States, people take less than 2 weeks of vacation. It's incredible. It's a very, very hard-working country. And I think because of that, it's also a country that's becoming increasingly anxious and depressed. The United States used to be number 1 in terms of happiness in the 1970s. It's now number 18. Mexico is number 17. Okay? So it's really incredible that the happiness levels are going down, partly because people are working so hard. And that's not necessarily a good thing. And we see from the examples of France and Germany that, in fact, restricting the number of hours in which you're thinking about work, and what that does is that in the time that you're not thinking about work, it refreshes you, it rejuvenates you. You come back to work much more mentally fresh. So this idea of forcing people to take vacations, which a company in Denver tried out, actually increased in that study the creativity and the productivity of the employees by 33%, by a full 1/3. All right, so now I want to turn to the more important topic of 3 things you can do for yourself in order to gain the sense of autonomy. And the very first thing that I want to talk about here is something that is already familiar to you. We spent quite a lot of time on this, which is leading a healthy lifestyle. Why is that going to give you a sense of autonomy? Well, it turns out that our perception of how much autonomy we have is not strictly dependent on the external situation alone. It depends a lot on how we perceive the situation. You remember this quote from Anais Nin, right? We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. Okay, so if in your mind you're feeling a sense of calm, you're feeling a sense of serenity, then even if the situation, objectively speaking, is constraining you, is not giving you a whole lot of autonomy, you subjectively feel to have a greater sense of autonomy. So you can do much more for yourself to gain this sense of autonomy than the external environment can do. You might have heard of Viktor Frankl, who wrote a really excellent book that got rated as one of the top 100 books by Time magazine of the 20th century, called Man's Search for Meaning. He was incarcerated by the Nazis during the Second World War, and by the time he was freed, his wife, his parents, his brothers, his sisters, his nephews, everybody had died. And he almost came this close to dying, not almost, he came this close to dying on a couple of occasions, but miraculously, he was alive. And he went on to write Man's Search for Meaning, and in that book he says that if you can find some sense of meaning in what you're doing, that is going to give you the sense of happiness through freeing you up. Okay? So what this means is that you can think about this desire for control as really falling into two main categories. One is external control, which is our most natural way of seeking control and autonomy, is by controlling other people, is by controlling external events. We talked about it at the beginning of the session. The other, which we don't talk about a lot or don't think about a lot, is internal control, control over our own minds. If you have a high degree of internal control, you can wear a t-shirt that says, no matter the weather outside, the weather in my head is always sunny. Okay? And we as human beings have this unique gift to be able to take this internal control because we have the ability to imagine. And our brain cannot distinguish between what we are imagining and what is reality outside. So whatever you imagine has a huge influence on your feelings. And therefore, through imagining positive things, you're able to regulate your own emotions.